Good morning. This week on Face the State, the Republican debate. We're taking a deep dive into the presidential election and exploring how the candidates are polling. I'm also asking our political experts about the frontrunner's decision to keep away from the rest of the pack. Ohio's Supreme Court weighs the future of abortions in this state, what it means for the law currently on the books, and looking ahead to November, will the justices have a decision before voters make their own? And it's one of the kingpins for the mayoral election. We explore the problems around juvenile crime and the system in place to serve justice. Good Sunday morning, and thank you for joining me on the first day of October. I'm Doug Petcash. There's much to get to this morning, but we start with the presidential election some 403 days away. Republican candidates are back on the campaign trail after a second debate. Once again, a debate not including the GOP frontrunner.
Excuse me. Thank you for speaking while I'm interrupting. While I'm speaking.
Well, you said Bob Dayful.
If I may finish.
You can't be on both sides.
Gentlemen, you'll have your turn.
One of the challenges we should have
a focus on the issues that matter.
debate between debate and debate.
The Republican debate ended like it began, with chaos and confusion about a clear party challenger to frontrunner Donald Trump. The candidates are urgently trying to dent the former president's commanding lead. Before we discuss the debate with our pair of political experts, I first want to take you back to Wednesday evening in Simi Valley, California. As 7 GOP presidential hopefuls took the stage at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library Wednesday night, the party's frontrunner was once again absent.
Donald Trump is missing in action.
He put $7 trillion on the debt. He should be in this room to answer those questions for the people you talk about who are suffering.
With a smaller stage, down one from their last debate, the candidates fought to break through.
Gentlemen, you'll have your turn.
One of the challenges we should have
focus on the issues that matter.
The man at the center lectern, Ron DeSantis, went into the night with a lot to prove. Once considered the party's best hope of dethroning former President Donald Trump, the Florida governor has lost ground in recent polls.
As commander-in-chief, I'm going to use the U.S. military to go after the Mexican drug cartels. They are killing our people.
After memorably clashing with several rivals in Milwaukee, Ohio native Vivek Ramaswamy said his goal this time around was to stress his policies and positions.
Unlock American energy. Drill, frack, burn coal, embrace nuclear energy. Put people back to work.
And former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley looked to build on the momentum her campaign gained from the previous debate.
We need to make sure we put 25,000 more Border Patrol and ICE agents on the ground and let them do their job.
As for the former president, Donald Trump once again skipped the debate. He'll do so again for the next debate. Wednesday night, he opted to hold an event in Detroit amid the ongoing auto workers' strike.
I've risked it all to defend the working class from the corrupt political class that has spent decades sucking the life, wealth, and blood out of this country.
New polling this morning is showing how the first voters of the 2024 election are feeling about the candidates. A CBS poll asked caucus voters how they are planning to vote come January. When it comes to Iowa, national frontrunner and former President Donald Trump also leads the Republican primary field comfortably. Most of his supporters are backing him enthusiastically. His current margins would translate to him getting half of Iowa's delegates. In New Hampshire, the former president also leads the polling. His current lead there would give him the lion's share of New Hampshire's delegates. Trump's big lead comes because of the qualities tested. He does very well on being seen as prepared and as a strong leader. Few describe Trump as likable. While fewer than half say he understands people like them or describe him as a true conservative, he nonetheless has a dominant lead among self-described conservative voters. This morning, I want to take some time to discuss the candidates' performance in this week's debate, as well as where the election stands so far. I talked with political science professor Christopher Devine with the University of Dayton. He is also an expert on presidential elections, and former Ohio Governor Robert Taft, who also teaches in the political science department at the University of Dayton.
Gentlemen, first of all, just A question for both of you, and we'll start with Governor Taft. What were your big takeaways from Wednesday night's debate?
Well, I thought the debate was a big win for the leader, Donald Trump, in that there were no breakout moments, there were no big mistakes. So there was nothing that's going to limit the field of candidates to go against Trump. As long as there's 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 candidates in there, the longer that goes on, the better it is for Trump, who of course has a big lead now. You've got to get down to 1 or 2 against Trump for anyone else to have a chance.
And how about for you, Christopher?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's always the dynamic to pay attention to, is Donald Trump as not just the front runner, but the front runner by quite a margin at this point, and skipping debates, the first 2 debates. I mean, when do we ever see that in presidential primaries? And shaking that up, dislodging him from that front runner status, I think is only going to happen if every candidate on that stage piles onto him for something like that and really criticizes him. And instead, you saw some moments. You saw the Donald Duck quote from Chris Christie. You saw Ron DeSantis at one point actually going directly after him, which he's been reticent to do throughout the campaign. But it wasn't a consistent theme. And a lot of what we saw more so was them fighting with each other, often, really interrupting each other quite a bit. But it really feels like they're running for second place.
And Governor, do you think that that's a good strategy on the former president's part to not debate?
I thought it was very smart. And of course, he was up in Detroit criticizing President Biden as if he's already the nominee. If he had been at the debate, then they might all have been piling on. I think it's a low risk strategy for him. He's already said he's not going to participate in the 3rd debate down in Miami. With his kind of lead, let them all, vie for second place. And, nobody really stood out. Everybody kind of held their own among the so-called also-rans. So that means I don't see how someone's going to get out before New Hampshire or before Iowa, even before South Carolina. You've got 2 candidates from South Carolina. Both are, potentially strong candidates, but that's not going to be good for either of them if they're both running against each other against Trump in South Carolina.
And, speaking of that race for second place, Cincinnati native and Columbus resident Vivek Ramaswamy is in a close contest now with Nikki Haley and Chris Christie. Christopher, what do you make of his performance at the debate and his campaign so far?
I think it was a continuation of what we saw in the first debate, where he commanded a lot of attention. In some ways he was often the focal point of the discussion, and getting some interesting reactions from other candidates. Of course, Nikki Haley's line about him making everyone dumber when he speaks, things like that. Even when he's being attacked, he's in the center of the conversation. And for someone who's never held political office, that's pretty impressive. So yeah, he's up in the polls now. I think we've seen some patterns like this before, where someone like that, who's an unknown, rises and then falls later as people get more serious about electing a president. So I think we're probably going to see that, especially as long as there's this lead for Donald Trump. Some other people might say that they're going to vote for Vivek Ramaswamy, if only because they just like kind of his style. But the idea that he's going to get the most votes in probably any state, I think is very unlikely.
And Governor, what do you think of Vivek Ramaswamy's performance so far?
Well, I think it's amazing for a first-time candidate how well he has done. It's quite remarkable. I don't know that he's established himself in the public view as someone who has the experience or the breadth of knowledge to be a president. He's certainly been a great candidate for the other candidates to attack in the debate. But as Chris said, that even gives him more exposure. So we'll see if he's in there for the long run. It's a really amazing phenomenon what he's done so far.
Governor, you talked about having that many candidates on stage, and this time there was chaos. They were cutting each other off. There was a lot of that back and forth. Let me speak. You'll get your turn. Do you find any value in a debate with that many people on stage?
Not really. There's not an opportunity for anyone to really establish themselves, to make strong, coherent points, to have a dialogue. I think it's very frustrating for most viewers to watch that kind of a debate where, 1 minute for answering a question, that's simply not enough time to have any kind of an in-depth discussion of the issues or to really get to know these people.
Discussion, negotiation, mediation, and compromise. 4 words used to describe what it took for the Ohio Redistricting Commission to come to a deal on new maps for State House and Senate districts. Tuesday night nearly became Wednesday morning before the commission made their decision. I was there for the long day as the votes came in.
Prove me wrong, please. I want you to prove me wrong. Draw fair districts.
Tuesday started with public testimony, all but one witness against the proposed Republican maps as drawn.
The commission violated the Constitution at every turn. The process was a failure. The maps were a failure.
The day ended nearly 13 hours later with a vote.
With a vote of 7-0, the maps are adopted.
A unanimous vote of the Ohio Redistricting Commission. All 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats said yes to newly modified maps that came together during a taxing day of closed-door talks.
This map is the result of an awful lot of hours of discussion, consideration, negotiation, mediation, and more discussion and negotiation.
We worked hard to find a compromise, and it's illustrated by the amended maps that we have before us today.
The Ohio Supreme Court shot down the last 5 redistricting maps as unconstitutional because they unfairly gerrymandered in favor of Republicans. Leaders on both sides believe the new Unified Bipartisan Redistricting Plan maps, as they're called, are constitutional. Still, their fate could be decided in the courts.
I think the intent is for it to be an 8-year map, but ultimately that's going to be up to the courts to decide. But I think with a bipartisan double vote, the Constitution there's an argument that it would be for the remainder of the decade.
Through redistricting, Democrats made potential gains from where they stand right now. In the House, Republicans hold 67 seats to the Democrats' 32. In the Senate, the advantage is 26-7. Under the new maps, Democrats could increase their seats in the House by 6 to 38. In the Senate, they could gain 3 with a chance of another 3.
Today, the Redistricting Commission is adopting a map that is more proportionally representative of Ohio voters.
At the end of the day, the long day, time will tell if Ohio voters make those redistricting predictions come true. And besides voters making decisions and potentially flipping their districts, what comes next for Ohio's maps? They could still be challenged in the Ohio Supreme Court. The last 5 versions have been, and all were rejected for partisan favoritism, which is what led up to this week's efforts. District maps aren't the only discussion the Supreme Court has recently had. This week, state officials urged the state's highest court to let a ban on abortion at 6 weeks of pregnancy take effect. It's important to note we're 5 weeks away from voters deciding whether that ban would be blocked, making abortion a constitutional right in this state. Governor Mike DeWine signed Ohio's law in 2019. It took effect last year after the Supreme Court overturned its landmark Roe v. Wade ruling. Ohio's Solicitor General asked the court Wednesday to reverse a preliminary order that blocks that law, an order made by a Cincinnati judge. There are lawsuits against the state, and this week justices began weighing whether the state can appeal. 10 TV anchor Lindsay Mills joins me on the desk this morning. Lindsay has really extensively covered Ohio's abortion debate. First of all, good morning, Lindsay.
Good morning, Doug. Thanks for having me here this morning.
Absolutely. So first of all, I want to start by asking, the very basic question, basically. What brought us to this point today and the Supreme Court kind of reviving the conversation on abortion?
Of course. So this has been a long legal battle, and here's how we got here today. You briefly covered it so far. Here's how we got here. When Roe v. Wade was overturned in the summer of 2022, the state's heartbeat law took effect, banning an abortion from the time a heartbeat is detected. 3 months later, the law was paused following a lower court's ruling. Attorney General Dave Yost appealed that ruling, and that brings us to oral arguments heard this week in the state's highest court over the case Preterm Cleveland versus Yost. The outcome will determine whether the injunction should be allowed to stand and if medical providers can bring a legal case on behalf of a patient. Doug?
And Lindsay, you touched on this. This case isn't really whether abortion should be legal in Ohio. Rather, it focuses on whether the Heartbeat Act should remain on hold. And I want to remind our viewers of that law right now. The law, again, signed by the governor in 2019, went into effect last summer. It criminalizes abortion if cardiac activity is detected in the embryo. That's typically within the first 6 weeks of gestation. However, the law does not have a gestational time limit. The law does have exceptions, one to prevent the death of the mother, the second due to a serious risk of major bodily function of the pregnant mother, and the third in cases of an ectopic pregnancy. So Lindsay, what is the argument that both sides have here?
So there are two areas of focus with this specific case. The state argues that every day this law is on hold is actually causing harm. They challenge the length of this process. They say that this injunction should not be allowed to stand. They also question the use of a third party being a medical provider. Now, Preterm Cleveland, the attorney representing that side, they say that a medical provider is the best to represent a patient on a legal case, especially in terms of abortion. And also, they believe that the injunction should be allowed to stand as it has been law for years here in Ohio.
So what's next? What's the next step in all this?
Exactly, of course. This is all under the backdrop of the November election, right, which is coming up faster than we can predict here. And I can tell you that depending on the outcome of this case, it could have an implication on whether the heartbeat law stands here in Ohio. But of course, that question will remain on the November ballot to enshrine the protections here in Ohio. But this case, of course, could have an impact on that as well.
So the vote could have an impact on the case, but the case doesn't have an impact on the vote that people will be taking in November.
Well, the case could affect the law, and it could reignite the abortion law here in Ohio, which bans abortions from 6 weeks on. But at the same time, voters will still see that question on the November ballot to enshrine protections. So what will that mean for the abortion law? We have yet to see. All
right, and I know you've been, as we said, covering this extensively. I know you'll keep on top of it for us as well as this plays out over the next 5 weeks plus.
Of course, Doug,
Lindsay,
thanks for having me.
Absolutely, thank you for being here. Well, still ahead this Sunday morning, the rise of missing persons cases in Ohio. We talked to the Attorney General about what the state is doing about it.
We've got almost 1,000 people on the missing persons list here in Ohio. Every one of those stories is a heartbreak, but the odds get a little bit better that we'll be able to close the loop if we know who went missing.
And welcome back to Face the State. I'm Doug Petcash. It's a frightening trend that no family ever wants to experience, a missing person investigation. And the problem in Ohio is very real. When you look at the numbers of missing people here, it's increased for the last 2 years. According to the Ohio Attorney General's office, more than 1,000 kids have been reported missing in our state just this year. Let's look at the numbers over the years. In 2021, a total of 14,000 missing children cases were filed. The next year, there was a more than 1,500 case increase in Ohio. I asked Attorney General Dave Yost about Missing Persons Day and what his office is doing to help provide answers and closure for families.
One of the really cool things is that we have been able to, in partnership with Ohio State University, BCI, has been able to do some 3D reconstructions from skeletal remains of people that have been found. And we have at least one case where that's already led to an identification of that victim and the ability to close the loop. The main thing is we need people to report. There can't be an investigation. Nobody will ever try to link up the identity if we don't know that somebody went missing. So we've got almost 1,000 people on the missing persons list here in Ohio. Every one of those stories is a heartbreak, but the odds get a little bit better that we'll be able to close the loop if we know who went missing.
So then how important is it to hold a day specifically that points, a spotlight on that issue?
Unless it's your loved one that's missing, you don't think about it. Nobody really spends much time. So the idea of Missing Persons Day is to raise awareness, to remind people that whether it's an older person who has maybe some mental or dementia kinds of issues and they wander off, whether it's an abduction or a violent crime, when a human being goes missing, that needs to be a big deal. We need to worry about that.
Still ahead here on Face the State, juvenile crime and juvenile justice. Welcome back. This morning, we're taking a closer look at the recent rise in crime happening in this city. It's become a major talking point for the election. You may have seen the ads already from the incumbent mayor, Andrew Ginther. His challenger, Joe Modell, telling 10 TV this week the mayor's office must prioritize people and neighborhoods and accept the responsibility of crime and create resources for people. This morning, we wanted to know what's being done to curb problems like teens stealing cars. We sent our Lacey Crisp to find out.
Everybody's bailing out. Teens stealing cars.
It's like every time I come here, y'all arrest me every time.
Crime Tracker 10 has warned you about the growing problem.
Stop! Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
And those repeat offenders. This 16-year-old girl was arrested by Whitehall police 4 times in about a month, including twice in 72 hours. She is not alone. According to the Franklin County Juvenile Courts, there were 956 stolen car cases in front of that courtroom from January to April of this year. 330 of the 956, or 35%, had multiple cases.
I can tell you when I look at a case, whether it's now as a judge or when I was a magistrate who would hear these types of cases, generally I would look at what has happened, so their history, not just like their recent history, but their entire juvenile history.
Franklin County Juvenile Court Administrative Judge Lachelle Stroud says juveniles need to be treated as such and should be placed in a program instead of being held when possible.
Our role as a court is to not treat juveniles as adults. It's not the purpose of our system. We have a completely different mission.
According to the Franklin County Juvenile Courts, about 63% of those juveniles brought in for car theft-related cases from January to April this year were held at the Juvenile Intervention Detention Center.
We all know the detrimental effects of holding youth in the Juvenile Intervention Center when they should not be there. Because just one night in the Juvenile Intervention Center will decrease their chances of graduating from high school by 50%.
But what about public safety?
So all of those questions should really go to risk and if there is a threat to the public safety.
There was a 93% increase in stolen car case filings in Franklin County Juvenile Courts from 2019 to 2022. The good news is that number has decreased 22% so far in 2023.
But when, the situation with the Kia and the Hyundais came up, we have since that point felt like we were making sure that we were flexible and being responsive to the issue because there was a need.
Whether or not to hold a youth is based on a point system. During the pandemic, that point system was changed so fewer youth were held. In recent weeks, the juvenile court has reverted back to pre-pandemic screening. This is what the scoring sheet looks like. It asks questions about what serious offenses the juvenile is facing and the level of violence, other cases, if weapons were used, or if the child is currently on an electronic monitoring device, or EMD. Stroud says the court is placing more juveniles accused of stealing cars on GPS ankle monitors, something they wouldn't have considered just a few years ago. She says the court is working on other ways to address the growing problem.
So those are some of the things that we did initially to say, yes, this is a problem. Yes, we want to be responsive to it.
Lacey Crisp, 10 TV News.
The court does offer several diversion programs to kids to try to keep them from spending time in jail. Depending on the youth and their family's needs, they'll place them in the best program to help the child and their family. Thank you for joining me this week here on Face the State. I'm Doug Petcash. Have a great Sunday.